So rather than discussing fascism or neo-fascism and the contemporary far right, I will be talking about the reinterpretation of the fascist collaborators from the Second World War in Serbia, and with references to the post-Yugoslav space since the early 90s. These are some of the questions that I will try to cover during this talk. And all my observations, I'm just trying to make a longer introduction as well people are coming in. This is based on the research that I did between 2013 and 2019 that was both studying the top-down official narratives, legal mechanisms and so on, as well as I did ethnographic fieldwork with various anti-communist groups, including also the far-right groups and parties. But yeah, so as I said, rather than discussing the contemporary far-right, I will be talking about the positive reinterpretation and rehabilitation of fascist collaborators of the Second World War, namely the Chetniks. And I will be discussing their construction as an anti-fascist movement and innocent victims of communism, of communist terror, which is of course also a parallel process of demonizing and criminalizing anti-fascism, communist anti-fascism, but also the partisans and of course logically the contemporary left. The starting point of this process of positive reinterpretation of various fascist collaborators such as the Chetniks, in the Serbian case, and I think in many other cases across Eastern Europe and broader, has been a result of a very broad general anti-communist political consensus. And rather than the work of some fascist, neo-fascist or far-right actors on their own, as it is usually perceived, at least in Serbia. I'm not going to have like theoretical introduction or something like that, but just a few points. I am interested in anti-communist memory politics and historical revisionism that is motivated by anti-communism, where liberal, conservative, right-wing, far-right discourses and actors are all intertwined and in agreement with each other, usually. And this is also the context for positive reinterpretation of fascist collaborators. This is, of course, something that affects left politics today because it does have a clear purpose of delegitimizing it in the present. More broadly, and I'm not going to go into details because Alexander tomorrow has a talk that will tackle more legal aspects of this issue as well as the EU context and EU accession context. But of course, anti-communism has been a hegemonic framework and consensus since the end of the Cold War internationally. And it stems, of course, from, and it often replicates a lot of Cold War era discourses that have also longer prehistory, but it particularly gained momentum, it got institutionalized, it received enormous funding, and became more aggressively promoted, particularly after 2008, of course, and at the EU level, where anti-totalitarianism represents the core of what we can call EU politics of memory. And this EU politics of memory legitimizes the local claims to deal with the communist past, to do away with the communist past, and so on, and also legitimizes revisionism, right-wing revisionism that, and liberal revisionism that seeks to rehabilitate various defeated military and political actors of the Second World War. So in Serbia, this process of anti-communist historical revisionism and memory work has gone through various phases since the early 90s. And also in my work, I looked at prehistories also stemming from the diaspora, from political immigration, as well as within Yugoslavia since the early 80s. But in the 90s, anti-communist historical revisionism roots itself within the democratic, liberal, conservative, and right-wing opposition to the regime of the Socialist Party of Serbia. Then, when all these parties come to power in 2000, it becomes basically the official state policy. And now, since 2012, with the We have the rehabilitation of the Chetniks normalized completely, but at the same time, it is followed by right-wing appropriation of the partisans and of the People's Liberation War and anti-fascism. But kind of to summarize, across the post-Yugoslav space, various fascist movements like the Ustaša in Croatia have been positively recast generally, and Socialist Yugoslavia or the People's Liberation War as its birthplace are either criminalized or the partisans are appropriated, depoliticized, and ethnified as either Serbian, as Macedonian, as Croatian, and so on. For those not familiar, very, very brief summary of the Second World War in Yugoslavia that won't do it justice, but just to kind of introduce the Chetnik movement. So the Second World War in Yugoslavia was, of course, as in many other contexts, a war of liberation and occupation, but it was also a socialist revolution led by the Communist Party of Yugoslavia that we referred to as the People's Liberation War or the People's Liberation Struggle. And against the partisans, there was a variety of various collaborationist forces, diverse in their ideology, diverse in the type of collaboration, and so on. And I focused here on the Chetniks, or the Yugoslav army in the homeland, because they became the main object of revision after 2000. And the Chetniks were led by Dragoljub Mihajlović, who is now a symbol of Serbian victimhood under communism. And the movement had support by the Yugoslav royal government in exile. They were only nominally a resistance movement, and they had allied support, for example, in 1943, but they also engaged in collaboration with practically everyone across the territory of Yugoslavia, and also war crimes. And what is very important to emphasize is that they never used the word anti-fascist to define themselves, and they never called themselves anti-fascist, but they did consider themselves a resistance movement. But of course, the Chetnik movement was not fascist movement. They didn't also consider themselves a fascist movement. They weren't fascist concerning their ideology, but they did employ what we can call a fascist culture of violence during the war that included terrorizing people who supported the partisans, who were supporting the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, that included also committing mass atrocities against civilians that were often ethnically motivated as well, and without any military purpose. And their main goal was, and this is really important, was maintaining pre-war political order at any cost. And here the partisans represented the most serious threat, and which is why fighting the partisans became the absolute priority for the Chetnik movement. And at the end of the war, the Chetniks, but also various other defeated political and military forces, either fled Yugoslavia or many faced punishment in the form of trials or executions, and this is the period that the narrow lens of revisionist anti-communist interpretation of the Second World War and Yugoslavia centers on as a lens. Of course, the People's Liberation War as revolution was the central theme of the revolutionary and anti-fascist memory culture of socialist Yugoslavia. In this context, various enemies of the partisans, collaborators, fascists, anti-communists, and those that intertwined all of that, were all equally condemned as people's enemies, as collaborators, as helpers of the occupiers, as those who worked against the liberation of the Yugoslav people continuously. And this war narrative was increasingly challenged within Yugoslavia, starting sometime from the early 80s, creating the narratives that emerged then created also a blueprint for later anti-communist revisionism that would become the official narrative after 2000. And in this period, we don't have really emergence of a lot of new narratives, but things that we can see in the 80s in various historiographic works and in public discourses basically are then taken into the 90s and become official after 2000. So in the 80s, in public discourses, in cultural production, in historiography, and so on, the narrative of the Chetniks as another resistance movement slowly creeps in. And as well as the problematic aspects of the People's Liberation War, which had not been unknown before in society, but they start being discovered throughout the 80s. And the Second World War experience becomes also ethnified and narrated from the perspective of individual nations. The first multi-party elections in the 90s, in the early 90s, consolidated the power of the Socialist Party of Yugoslavia, that was the legal successor of the League of Communists. And as the country was disintegrating and entering a series of armed conflicts. And the politics of memory and the relationship with the Second World War of the regime of Slobodan Milošević was quite ambiguous, because they represented themselves as guardians of the legacies of the People's Liberation War, as defenders of Yugoslavia, and we have here a lot of celebrations of various liberation days, of Victory Day and so on, where anti-fascism is celebrated, but also if we look into these commemorations and speeches and discourses surrounding them, we can see that the People's Liberation War that is celebrated here is deprived of its revolutionary aspect. It is transformed into exclusively Serbian. It is instrumentalized for war propaganda and depicts usually other Yugoslav people as fascists only. And then in this context, because we can trace back the narratives of the so-called democratic government after 2000 to this period of the early 90s already, because commemorations of the defeated Second World War forces, such as the Chetniks, and various others considered victims of communism, emerged within this political opposition in the 90s, which really rallied around anti-communism as like the unifying factor, regardless of other ideological differences. And if we look at the first party manifestos of any political party that emerged in the late 80s or early 90s in Serbia, they really all called for dealing with the communist past. They all named it the worst thing that had happened to Serbia, to its people, and they all called for national reconciliation and the end of the civil war that started on the 7th of July 1941, which then also was transformed into the official narrative after 2000. And among them, of course, some parties drew directly legitimacy and claimed continuity with the Chetnik movement. And in this broad context of various commemorations, anti-communist commemorations that were also religious usually, the regime was tolerating them after 1991, and there was only one commemoration that was prevented. And then, of course, the Serbian Radical Party was in the ruling coalition for some time during the 90s as well, the party that was really founded on the Chetnik tradition and organized many of these events as well. And in the 90s, I think why this is important and interesting to look at, and I think it is not sufficiently looked at, these different liberal democratic right-wing opposition parties and actors in the 90s, they really show us the variety of the Chetnik revival, in the sense also of its practices and the reasoning behind it, because we have here liberals, democratic parties, various monarchists, far-right, neo-fascists, all in a way commemorating the same actors and same ideologies, but also we have their commemorations as victims of communism, religious commemorations as victims of communism, and then, of course, we have the revival of Chetnik ideology and practices in ethnically motivated atrocities in the war in Bosnia, for example. Of course, here there is also the rise of various neo-Nazi groups that glorify various fascist movements, not only the Chetniks, and of course, we can see it also in the wars in Bosnia and Croatia, but also in these other countries that some of these various fascist movements become celebrated and honored at different levels of society. In 2000, Slobodan Milošević is replaced by this democratic coalition that comes to power, that draws its narrative from, that draws its legitimacy from the narrative, the simplified narrative of a democratic revolution, and that want to portray themselves as liberators of Serbia from communism. And anti-communism, I argue, becomes the central state policy beyond memory politics. Aggressive dismantling of legacies of Yugoslav state socialism is present in all spheres, in education, in healthcare, in economy, and finally also it is supported by politics of memory that gives the historical narrative to all this. And the discourses that I mentioned from the 80s and from the 90s become the official shape the official memory politics. First, we have disappearance of cleansing of socialist Yugoslavia from the public space, which in a way already started in the 90s. Then we have the narrative of victimhood under communist terror that becomes very prominent. And in this context of the victimhood under communism, Axis collaborators are rehabilitated as victims of communism. And at the same time, the partisans, of course, are criminalized. And the Second World War becomes the most prominent object of revision because it was the main legitimacy source of Yugoslav state socialism, which was something that had to be quickly dealt with. And of course, if communism is to be rejected, these various liberal political actors had to invent some kind of different Second World War anti-fascism that wasn't communist. And this brings us to the reinvention of the Chetniks as anti-fascists and then also as victims of communism. So even though they never refer to themselves as such, the Chetniks become basically the true Serbian anti-fascist movements. And they were officially equalized with the partisans through the narrative of two anti-fascist movement of Serbia, but this equalization, I would argue, is just an illusion because at the same time, we have a very strong process of criminalization of the partisans as perpetrators and, of course, as ideologically unacceptable, while the Chetniks, any problematic aspects of the Chetnik movement are completely denied, even denied as communist conspiracy against them and so on. And the anti-communist nature of the Chetnik movement is crucial here because they can be represented then as the defenders of Serbia from communism. They can be represented as true representatives of Serbian people, as honorable, as upholding traditional values, and so on. And how does this work? Is that what I mentioned before, that both the Second World War and socialist Yugoslavia are observed through this very, very narrow lens of the end of the Second World War and the first post-war years. And the broader context of the war and facts are ignored. And then if we look at the Chetniks only through this tiny lens of punishment at the end of the war, they, of course, can become a resistance movement. They can become innocent victims of communism. They can become anything, especially considering their ambiguous nature, that they did consider themselves a resistance movement, that they did have ties to the government in exile and so on. So they're very easy object of revision, much easier than movements that were openly fascist and that were collaborating also openly, even though everyone knew about the Chetnik collaboration, of course. At the same time, this focus on the narrow period of the end of the war and the post-war years turns the partisans only into perpetrators. And finally, if we again observe socialist Yugoslavia as well through this lens of the post-war years, its most repressive period, it becomes, socialist Yugoslavia becomes a purely negative historical experience that again has to be dealt with. And this image of the past from the early 2000s was promoted through really numerous television series, documentaries, films, museums, publications by revisionist historians and so on in school textbooks. And then added to that are the state-sponsored initiatives that resemble mechanisms of transitional justice. So we have rehabilitation laws, we have investigative commissions, one for everyone executed by the communists, the other one only for Dragoljub Mihajlović. Then there were these changes to veteran laws that were supposed to provide the Chetnik veterans with benefits similar to those of the partisans. And why is this important that they use the mechanisms that resemble transitional justice is that anti-communism is simply represented as a liberal strive for dealing with the past, for honoring the victims, so it is never openly narrated as having a goal of rehabilitating fascism, of course. And this was an absolute political consensus in the parliamentary politics in Serbia, because if you look at the parliament proceedings when they were voting for this veteran law, for example, or rehabilitation laws, we can see that there was almost no resistance in the parliament or government. And while now we have kind of a liberal consensus of how everything was much better before 2012, it is these people who are in the opposition also today, these parties who also voted for all these laws, equally and together with the parties that are currently in power. And we actually, interestingly, can only see the only criticism that comes against these laws is actually by the representatives, MPs of the Socialist Party of Serbia, which is really interesting. Other than that, there is absolute consensus regarding any legislation that condemns the partisans and communism. So in this context, and in the broader international context, why the Chetniks became the ideal historical reference is because they can be framed as a movement that fought against both totalitarianisms, of course, and then they ended up as victims of the communist one. And the Chetniks are also more broadly became symbols of the Serbian victimhood under communism, and this is present already in the 90s in the opposition, but after 2000 it goes across the public sphere, politics, and historiography, because every initiative, every film, exhibition, law, commission will have the Chetniks at the center. Even if they seem that they are about the suffering of the ordinary people under communism and so on, it is always about the Chetniks. And this is, for example, the House of Terror style exhibition in the name of people that was in Belgrade and was traveling around Serbia that focused on the communist terror, that had at the center some objects that belonged to Dragoljub Mihajlović, had the reenactment of his prison cell and so on. So it is really always about them, rather than what it claims to be the dealing with the past, transitional justice, and so on. And what is also part of this is that the narrative of the elites of Serbia and intelligentsia ruined by communism also thrives in this period and appeals to many people who rewrite often their biographies to fit into it. And when I did the ethnographic fieldwork and interviews with various people who are part of various anti-communist groups fighting for memorials and so on, they all rewrote their biographies into this narrative, and they rewrote their biographies into the narrative of them being victims in socialist Yugoslavia, even though they got their education, started their very successful careers in that period, earned their pensions and so on, but they still have this narrative of being branded as a child of the people's enemy, being prevented to succeed, and so on and so forth. While, of course, everyone else is supposed to be convinced that, and that's what Anna also mentioned in the introduction, everyone else is supposed to be convinced that all the problems of neoliberal capitalism, all the problems of transition are because of the communist past and stem from the communist past rather than from the post-socialist present. And slowly to, so in this context of invention of non- and anti-communist anti-fascism, the only way, of course, that the partisans can be commemorated is if they are revised to fit in a way this pattern. And this is the case in Serbia now, where the partisans are celebrated, but as a Serbian army without the revolutionary ideological Yugoslav aspects of it, where, of course, in this broader context also, Marxist historiography is not considered, the approach is not considered legitimate in the Serbian historiography still, and so on. And I use this, I quote this Eric Gobetti's book, And What About Foibe, because I think this also summarizes great the delegitimization of the left in the past and present that is connected to historical revisionism, because in Italy as well, and, and you know it probably from many other contexts, that any conversation is always used to go back to the to the communist crimes. So like whatever you say, it will be like, what about Foibe? What about the post-war executions? And criminalizing anti-fascism is criminalizing Yugoslav state socialism, but also the contemporary left, where any really evoking of socialism comes back to this question, and what about the communist crimes? And this tendency, of course, is beyond Serbia and the post-Yugoslav space, and it is a hegemonic discursive tool to criminalize the left. In the Serbian context, and I think we can see it across the post-socialist Central and Eastern Europe, this is not merely politics of memory that stays on this level of rewriting the past, but it is also about the political elites showing that no alternative to capitalism can exist, and any attempts from the past to find an alternative was a disaster for the nation. And I thought that for the end I should at least a bit refer to the far right, because that's the topic of the panel as well. So the far right actors across the post-Yugoslav space also celebrate the defeated military and political forces of the Second World War, of course. In Serbia, it is the Chetniks primarily, but there are also other actors such as the fascist movement Zbor, and also across the post-Yugoslav space we have like various historical references of the Second World War that are used in this context. Far-right memory politics is usually also seen as the opposite to liberal democracy, but they also share a lot of same tropes, and this is what I was trying to show today. Concerning anti-communism, concerning the Chetniks, there is a significant overlap between the historical claims and positioning of the far right and neo-fascists and liberal political actors. And the authoritarian rule in liberal democracy, like Serbia or like Hungary today, persists and functions in a way as a one-party rule that intertwines liberal democracy and the far right, that co-opts the far right in the Serbian case, and also shows us that there is no significant contradiction between the two. And I use this photo because I think the overlap between, for example, the Serbian political party and the various far right groups is a great example, because we can see it even in the celebrations of the Victory Day, where the victory against fascism first merges with the 90s wars, particularly the war in Kosovo. But more importantly, we have the far-right and right-wing groups proudly commemorating it, and even leading these memorial processions, celebrating the victory against fascism by communist-led forces of Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union. So to conclude all of this, what I gave the overview of today, I also have a book about it. And the book is on Libgen, so anyone can download it, but if you can't find it, here's my email address. I will be happy to share the PDF with anyone. Thank you.